Okay, so if you're a new photographer and you're looking at reviews and tutorials on photography, they might be talking about some terminologies and jargon that you might not know exactly what they're talking about. So I wanted to make a video quickly discussing those terminologies, and let's start with the basics. Okay, so aperture is how wide the opening in the lens can get, and generally speaking, the wider the aperture, the more light can come through, and that allows for like low light shooting. But more importantly, if you're taking portraits, it affects the depth of field and how good the background blur will be. So generally speaking, you'd want a really wide aperture so that you can get that really nice depth of field. But if it's like an analogy for the eye, aperture is like how wide your eyes can get. And so the wider your eyes get, the more light can come in and the more information you can get that way. So shutter speed is how long your shutter is open for. And so the shutter is the thing in the camera that closes when you take a picture. And so the longer the shutter is open for, the more light you can bring in, but also the more motion and motion blur you can add the longer your shutter is open for. But also, if your shutter is open for less time, the more frozen your subject will be because the shutter is only open for so long. But that also cuts down on the light. And so if you put it back to the analogy of the eye, it's how long your eyes are open for. And so the longer your eyes are open for, the more light and information you can get, but that also can introduce some more issues. Okay, so ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. And so the more sensitive your camera is, the more artificially boosted the photo will be. But then the more ISO you introduce, the more grain and artifacts you'll add to the photo. And bringing it back to the analogy of the eye, it's like how adjusted your eye is to nighttime. And so it might not be the greatest quality when you can see at night, but at least you can see it. Exposure is just the photo you take and the combination of those three variables. And photography as a whole is just balancing and knowing what to do with those three variables to get the end product that you're looking for. Okay, so for this next part, we're going to learn about lenses and how to read the information on the lens themselves. Millimeter is the measurement of the field of view for the lens. And so the smaller the number, the wider field of view you'd have, but the bigger the number, the more zoom and reach you'd have with the lens itself. So f-stop is the measurement of how wide the aperture is, but it might be a little counterintuitive because the smaller the f-stop number, the wider the aperture. So when you're shopping for a wide aperture lens, you want to look for the smallest f-stop number. And you might also hear something called like a fast lens. And what that means is the aperture is wide. And so when you have a wide aperture lens, you can introduce more light, and then you can speed up or lower the time of the shutter speed, which was why it's called a fast lens. So you might have heard the term shooting wide open, and what that means is you're opening the aperture up so that you have more light coming in and you're thinning out the focus area, and that's basically it. So you might have heard the term stepping down, and all that means is closing the aperture so that more of the photo is in focus. That's all. So you might have heard the term prime lens, and what that means, it's a fixed focal length. And generally speaking, it's seen as a higher quality because it has less moving parts than its counterpart, which is a zoom lens. And so zoom lenses have multiple focal lengths, and there's some give and takes. Obviously, the zoom lens has way more versatility since it has more lengths that it can move to, but of course the prime lens is seen as a little bit better since there's less moving parts. So you might have heard a macro lens, and what that means is it's a lens that has a really small minimum focal distance, which allows it to get really close to things and still focus. And the opposite of that is a telephoto lens, which is just like a zoom lens, and yeah, that's basically it. telephoto means zoom. So you might have heard the word bokeh, which means the quality of the out of focus area in a photo. And then there's also the bokeh balls, which are out of focus areas with light. And so when you have out of focus areas with the light, it makes like a nice circular bokeh ball, and just the quality of that. You might have heard the term full frame, and what that means is it's a digital equivalent of the old 35mm film, and it's a bigger sensor, so it has higher resolution and it works better in low light. And so it's generally more desirable than the other, which is the crop sensor. So crop sensor is a smaller sensor, and when you use like full frame lenses on that camera, it crops in on the sensor, so you don't get the full POV that you usually do when you use it on a full frame. And that's basically it. Full frame is just, generally speaking, better than a crop sensor. So there's another camera format called the Micro Four Thirds, and it's an even smaller sensor than the crop sensor. But because of the small size of the sensor, it can be put in a really small camera, and the video recording on that is really, really good, which is why cameras like the GH4 and the GH5 use that from Panasonic. And so if you wanted to focus on video recording, the Micro Four Thirds format might be something to look into. You might have heard the term DSLR, and what that means is there's a mirror inside the camera, and this is kind of old technology at this point, and there's a new version called mirrorless, which gets rid of that mirror, so the camera is a lot lighter and is a little bit more advanced, and so you have better quality out of the mirrorless cameras. One of the big advantages of the mirrorless versus DSLR is that the mirrorless has an electronic viewfinder, or EVF. And what that does is when you're looking through the viewfinder, you see exactly what you're going to take a picture of and what the exposure is going to look like, as opposed to DSLR, where the DSLR can only display what the mirror is reflecting and not what the exposure is going to look like after. So you might have heard the term shooting in RAW or shooting in JPEG. And so all that means is the format of the photos that you're taking photos in. And so if you shoot in JPEG, which is the default, that means when you edit those photos, all the color information and color science and white balance and stuff is baked into that JPEG photo. And so it's really hard to change all that stuff afterwards. But if you shoot in RAW, you can bring that into Lightroom or Photoshop, and it's a bit more malleable, so you have a bit of an easier time editing those photos. And so I really do recommend shoot in RAW, and so it might change your life. I definitely love shooting in RAW. You might have heard the term dynamic range, and all that means is the difference between the lightest light and the darkest dark. And then when you bring it into editing, how you're able to pull the information from those bright spots and the dark spots. So if you have a good camera with high dynamic range, you're able to pull a lot of information from those lights and darks. That's all it really means. You might have heard the term focus breathing when you're looking at a lens review. And so what that means is when a camera is looking for focus with a lens, if it changes the focal length when it's trying to focus, that means it's breathing, and so it might change your framing or something along those lines. So it's not good. And then the other thing is called focus hunting, and that's when a lens is having issues really trying to find focus, and so it goes and focuses to the back, and that's called back focusing, which is also bad. And so these are all bad things associated with focusing. Here's a quick one. You might have heard the term glass, and all that means is just a short version of lenses. So you say, oh, I really like fast glass, which means you really like wide aperture lenses. So you might have heard the term pixel peeping or pixel peeper, and all that means is a person or yourself downloading a photo and then zooming in really far into the photo to make sure that the focus is right or everything looks correct. It's generally seen as something bad because you don't really need to zoom in that far to see if a photo is that good, especially when you're not going to see it when you print it out or anything like that. So it's not that big a deal. It's something that you can do for yourself to make sure that you're nailing that focus. So something that photographers love to talk about is the golden hour, and that's basically 1 hour before sunset and 1 hour before sunrise. And that's when the light from the sun is like this golden hue, and it looks really good to take photos on, and it's really awesome. So I definitely recommend, if you can, take photos during that golden hour. All right guys, so that's it for me. If this really helped you out, please give us a thumbs up. It helps us out a lot. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But if you want to see more stuff like this, please drop a subscription. It'll be great for us. And I do plan on making a kind of like a beginner's course to go through the 3 main aspects of photography and go into them in depth and how to use them for certain things like portraits or landscapes. And so if you want to check those out when they're available, drop a subscription, but I'll see you guys later.